He was a real estate tycoon with expensive tastes.
He wanted people to know that he had money, that he was successful.
He's the kind of person that when he came in the room, you knew he had come in the room.
Until his mile-high ambitions came crashing down to earth.
For someone to be literally blown up in a high-profile, high-end Tucson resort was very attention-grabbing.
The investigation would delve into the exclusive world of Tucson's rich and famous to catch an assassin out to make a killing.
The story is the epitome of American greed.
Friday, November 1st, 1996. It's a little after 5 p.m., and Tucson's leisure class is kicking off the weekend with a round of golf. The players are among the city's most rich and powerful, and the biggest name on the course is 52-year-old Gary Triano.
Gary Triano was a very charismatic personality. He was sort of a larger-than-life real estate mogul.
Every Friday, he would be out on the course with people he was trying to get to invest in his latest venture.
But this time, Gary's wheeling and dealing ends with a bang.
And at the end of the golfing, he came back to his car, and when he got into his car, the bomb went off.
The explosion is described as like a funnel cloud that can be seen for miles from this resort.
The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield's gone.
It looked like somebody had just crushed this Lincoln Continental like a matchbox.
First responders quickly arrive, but 52-year-old father and businessman Gary Triano is pronounced dead at the scene.
There was no chance that Gary was going to survive this explosion. He was right on top of it.
How could somebody hate somebody so much to want to murder them in such a violent and public way?
Gary Triano was a longtime resident of Tucson who'd grown up with dreams of making it big.
He was a Tucson kid, went to the University of Arizona, was in business with his father, if I remember right, selling cars in the beginning.
Gary was first married to Mary Cram, and they were a very, very powerful couple, I would say. They had 2 children.
By the early 80s, Gary had closed enough deals to become Tucson's leading real estate developer.
If you were someone who was involved in the financial business in Tucson, Gary Triano was somebody you would have known.
Gary was very flamboyant. He was a high roller. When he had money, he would spend money. He would tip lavishly. He would go on long trips to Europe.
But Gary also took care of those less fortunate.
Gary was very philanthropic, and he believed in the Boys and Girls Club here. He was very, very good to this community.
In 1986, Gary's reputation earned him the attention of another Tucson luminary, Pamela Phillips.
But Pam was, kind of up by the bootstraps gal from Tucson.
She wanted to be one of the first females that was in commercial real estate in Tucson. And she achieved that. She made it all the way to the top.
Gary hosted numerous parties, and friends tell me that she would go to these parties, and that's how they met.
She sort of crashed the party, zeroed in on Gary. They had a whirlwind romance. They get married right away. They have a very lavish wedding. It's a black tie affair on a yacht in San Diego.
He left Mary to get married to Pamela Phillips.
They were kind of a power couple. in Tucson. Donald Trump came here at one point with Marlo Maples and stayed with them for about a month.
They became friends and later went down to Mar-a-Lago.
They become part of that jet set where they're flying off to, have lunch in Greece or flying to his estate in Florida.
But in the early 90s, Gary and Pam's jet-setting days came to a sudden end.
He was, tapped out. I mean, all those wonderful jet trips cost a lot of money.
She realizes that her marriage is not what she believed it to be when she's pregnant with her first child. But 2 kids into the marriage, she's now having to put up her own money to keep Gary afloat.
Gary was forced out of one of the Indian gaming businesses at the time, and once he was forced out of that, as well as some of the real estate things that were going on, Gary lost money and ended up having to file for bankruptcy.
Gary started getting into real trouble financially, and I think Pam got very scared for her and her children's safety because of that. And I think that's what finally triggered the divorce.
I mean, they were not happy with each other. So she takes the kids and takes off to Aspen. He's gone through a bankruptcy. He is living in a spare bedroom of a friend of his. He's driving a borrowed car. He's more down and out than he's been for quite a while.
In spite of these setbacks, Gary was determined to turn his life around.
Gary was the type of guy that he would never give up, and even though he was down today, there was a real good chance that by next year he'd be back on top.
He wanted to convey the image and the message that he was making some kind of a comeback.
But he would never get the chance. Someone had made sure Gary never climbed back to the top, and Tucson police are determined to find out who.
Everybody was in total disbelief. This is the kind of stuff that you read about, you see it on TV, but you don't think it's going to happen to you.
This is not only a who-did-it case and a how-done-it case. What would drive somebody to do this?
Coming up, Gary Triano was deeper in the hole than anyone realized.
When reporters asked the sheriff if there are any suspects, Sheriff Dupnik said, "Open the phone book."
Millionaire real estate developer Gary Triano has been killed by a car bomb outside of Tucson's exclusive La Paloma Country Club. Police arrive to find the area in complete chaos.
It's really hectic because you've got bits and pieces of the car all over the parking lot. You've got golfers and employees wandering out now into the crime scene. It's pandemonium.
Initially, what we do is we totally contain the scene. So in other words, we shut down the entire country club. What you see initially when you actually go to the blast scene is there's a Lincoln Town car sitting parked in a parking space. The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield was blown out of the car over the trees and landed in the swimming pool.
There were parts of the car up on the roofs of the buildings nearby.
To see a major, massively destructive blast like this was a first for me. I mean, this would be the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle, with no picture of what the puzzle was.
The crime scene is so complex, federal agents are brought in to assist the investigation. Over the next few days, they are able to reconstruct the bombing.
It's not just the sheriff's department at that point, but they call in assistance from the Tucson Police Department bomb squad. ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The FBI comes in.
The ATF guys, they took all the pieces of the material back to their lab in California, and they started telling us about how it was a pipe bomb.
The bomb looked like it had been sort of like it was an amateur had done it. You know, it was a 17-inch pipe bomb, which was already a strange measurement for a pipe bomb.
The device was actually overbuilt for its purpose. It was far more explosive power than was needed. Our belief was it was built off the instructions off the internet and probably wasn't built to the specifics of killing a sole occupant of a vehicle.
The bomb itself, we were able to determine, was housed in a canvas bag, a mundane canvas bag, easily purchased. Through interviews, we knew that Gary very rarely locked his car, so it was not hard to believe that the killer just opened the car door, placed the bag with the bomb in it.
What we didn't know is what detonated the device. Was it motion activated? Was it on a timer? Or was it command detonated?
Eventually, what ATF is able to determine is that it was remote controlled. The killer was probably within 100 yards, laying in wait with his remote detonator.
And that told us that the killer had to be in the parking lot. They had to watch Gary get into the car that night before they detonated the bomb.
And the bombers set their trap for Gary during his birthday weekend.
It was his birthday, and there was a celebration for him that weekend. So he may very well have thought that this was somebody, a friend, that dropped off a birthday present for him.
The golf outing had been prearranged so that the family knew where he was going to be and when he would be coming back home.
They were waiting, all excited to surprise him, and instead, their surprise turned into a nightmare. Had to have been somebody who knew Gary, knew his habits.
He had to sit there patiently waiting after he planted the device in the car. And then once he saw Mr. Triano get in the car, he pulls the trigger.
It's pretty evil when you think about it.
When investigators speak to Gary's family, they say he's made more than a few enemies over the years.
What we found out pretty soon was that Gary had a lot of business dealings, but he currently was in a large amount of debt, over $26 million in debt.
It was clear by the end of his life that he was spending a lot of money he didn't have.
Gary had lots of friends in high places, and he was able to sort of, rob Peter to pay Paul. He was always doing a sort of shell game where he was shuffling money around.
Gary's ex-wife believes one of those enemies decided to get payback.
When Pam and I met at the sheriff's department, she talked a lot about the Indian gaming and about threats as a result of the Indian gaming.
She believes that Gary, was involved in all kinds of nefarious dealings and that it had to have been organized crime somehow.
She said he was on a hit list, and she was scared. And I never saw her scared.
We talked to numerous people who told us that Gary had mentioned to them that he felt like he was being followed. We never were able to get anything that we felt like we could follow up on as far as identifying who that might be.
If you owe money to the mob, they kill you publicly so other people get the message.
Coming up, a shocking tip leads investigators across state lines.
When you take all the information that was found, you can't ignore it. It's almost like this guy has got his shopping list to murder Gary Triano.
Tucson police are investigating the murder of 52-year-old real estate mogul Gary Triano. And the evidence so far suggests his killer might be connected to the mafia.
Tucson is the place that a lot of reputed mobsters have retired in because they consider it safe. It's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. The Bonanno family retired there. The Castellanos retired there.
The idea that it was a mob hit, it came from the fact that it was a car bombing.
When you think of a car bomb, you think of sort of East Coast mafia, mob kind of thing.
With over $25 million in unpaid debts, the list of suspects seems endless.
Gary had borrowed money from a lot of different people. There were investors in Mexico that some people thought were, less than reputable. he had actually started negotiations with a group in China.
Gary Triano not only owed $4.5 million to casinos in Las Vegas, he was threatening a lawsuit against a guy named Gary Fears in St. Louis.
Gary had so many enemies that, it would have been easier to find out who wanted to keep him alive than want him dead.
Detectives track down every possible lead, but despite his suspicious business dealings, they keep coming up empty-handed.
In the days and weeks after the bombing, detectives are interviewing every known associate of Gary Triano that they can find.
You follow out the thread of organized crime. You follow out the thread of a person who was financially crippled by Mr. Triano's failed financial advice. And as you followed each of those out through the investigation, they all just went away. There was nothing in his life that when you took it and amassed it and put it together that led to a motive for murder.
Then, just as the investigation seems to hit a dead end, the Pima County Sheriff's Office receives some unexpected help.
It was national news, and that first week after the bombing, I got a message to call a detective in Aspen, Colorado. And that's when I first met Detective Jim Crowley. Detective Crowley talked to me about a fraud investigation that he was involved in, that Ron Young was the principal suspect.
He was a businessman who was really more of a confidence man.
Investigators learned that 7 months before Gary Triano's murder, Aspen authorities were preparing to bring in Ron Young on fraud charges. He disappeared before they got the chance.
He was on the run. He was on the run because he had a warrant out for his arrest.
Ron Young had rented a van using a fictitious credit card. And result of that, the van was reported stolen.
The van stolen in Aspen had turned up in California 1 month before the murder, and it appears to contain new evidence investigators now realize is connected to Gary's murder.
In October of 1996, in Brea, California, some neighbors report a van that's been parked on their street in a cul-de-sac for a few days. They call the local law enforcement. The cop sees it as a stolen vehicle, and they call the detective up in Aspen that had taken the stolen report and say, we got this van, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it that we have no idea what this means.
Jim Crowley, the detective from Aspen, searches the van, and in it he finds a sawed-off shotgun. He finds notes that list close relations or friends of Gary Triano. He finds a map of Tucson.
Detective Crowley says, hey, I saw the bombing on the news, and I think that bombing is related to a fraud case that I've been working in Aspen.
He knew that he had to get a hold of us and share his information with our investigation.
When Tucson detectives inspect the van's contents, they find more clues connecting Ron to the bombing.
We went back to all the contents of the van and really delved into them. And that's when we found friends and relatives, car descriptions, car license plates of friends and family close to Gary Triano.
They've got receipts from a hotel here in Tucson that was in close proximity of where the Triano house was.
We went to the hotel and went through all their receipts from 1996, and we were able to show that Ron had stayed in this hotel here in Tucson for about a week prior to the murder.
It's quite possible when Gary told his friend that he felt somebody was following him, it was Ronald Young.
But why would a con man from Aspen murder a struggling Tucson real estate developer?
It's all very suspicious, but where's the motive? At this point, Ron Young has just disappeared. He is nowhere to be found. He has gone off the maps.
Coming up, investigators follow the money to find the missing pieces of the puzzle.
In other words, who benefited financially from Gary's death?
Thanks to a call from the Aspen Police Department, investigators in Tucson have discovered that a con man named Ronald Young was targeting Gary Triano. The question is, why? As detectives in Arizona and Colorado compare notes, they realize the two men share a personal connection.
Jim Crowley, a detective with the Aspen Police Department, he said, I happen to have interest in Pam Phillips, who is Gary Triano's ex-wife.
Before the bombing happens, Detective Crowley gets an interesting phone call from Pam Phillips about a year prior. Pam Phillips calls him up because Pam has realized that she's just been defrauded, bilked out of $300,000 by Ron.
She called me and said, yeah, I just got taken and this guy just, took all my money.
But it seems Pam had quickly withdrawn the accusation.
Crowley goes into depth that publicly she cried wolf, that Ron Young had done these horrible financial things to me, but wouldn't go on record and wouldn't file a report with the Aspen Police Department.
Meanwhile, Ron and her kind of make up, and she strangely calls Detective Crowley and says, you know what? It was my mistake. I made an accounting error, and I don't want to press charges anymore.
I'd ask her about him, and she'd just turn her head and walk away. She never, ever said his name again.
Pam's friends think they know why. According to them, the two had started out as business partners about a year after her divorce, but their relationship wasn't strictly professional.
Initially, their relationship is sort of a teacher-pupil relationship. Ron is making himself useful in Pam's life. He's taking care of her business, and their relationship sort of morphs into more than a business arrangement.
And it came out that she was romantically involved with Ronald Young in Aspen.
Every once in a while, they'll have drinks too late, and Ron will wind up asleep on the couch, sometimes then wanders into the bedroom.
I think Pam used her beauty and sex for men in that way. That was her tool.
Investigators now know that Pam is the connection between Ron and Gary Triano. But had Ron been using her to get to her husband? Or was Pam in on the plot?
It could be, certainly, that Ron Young had sort of looked into Pam Phillips's background, collected a lot of information about her and her ex-husband to try to perpetrate some further fraud on her.
The big question that remained for Detective Gamber was, did he work alone? Did Ron Young do this on his own?
To test Pam, investigators ask her to come in for an interview.
During the interview, I didn't want her to know how much I knew about Ron. So when I pretty much nonchalantly threw his name out, there was just a long pause.
She's denying his relationship with her. She completely minimizes him and their relationship to the point of, how did you hear about him?
Outwardly, she appeared to cooperate with the investigation. It wasn't until we asked her if she would take a polygraph that she started some more pausing and some more, no, I don't know if I want to do that.
Police find Pam's behavior suspicious. But she and Gary were already divorced. So what motive would she have for killing him?
We have to follow the money. And where it got interesting is when we started to look at Pam Phillips.
We had pulled the divorce records, and we knew that there were a lot of issues. The divorce wasn't smooth. There was fight over the children. There was allegations that Gary was hiding money.
This is a time when Pam is running out of money. I mean, she tells the au pair at one point that she's down to her last $60,000.
As investigators dig deeper, they discover that Pam still stood to gain a lot from Gary's death.
The detectives are doing their due diligence. They do find out about the insurance policy that Pam Phillips had on Gary's life, that she maintained even after the divorce.
The insurance policy consisted of a $2 million life insurance. I was told, and then we were able to confirm through records, that the children were the beneficiaries.
But the children are minors, and so Pam's the guardian, of course, so she's getting the money.
Pam took that money and bought her first house with it in Aspen. I was invited over there to go house hunting with her.
It's like, who had the most to benefit and who had the motive? And Pam Phillips had the motive.
But investigators know it's still not enough to make an arrest.
So the really frustrating part about this case is that, they have all of this evidence, but there's too many loose ends.
Pam Phillips was definitely a potential suspect. However, one of the main people that we wanted to talk to was a fugitive, and he was nowhere to be found.
By November of 1997, the case has come to a complete standstill. Detectives begin to wonder if it will ever be solved.
We revisit the story on the 1-year anniversary. Still no arrests, no one in custody, no person of interest, nothing, nada.
The only really unknown at the end of the task force was we needed to talk to Ron Young.
Coming up, the hunt for the missing con man finally ends.
So after this long 9-year hiatus, they finally get the tip.
Nearly a decade after the murder of Gary Triano, detectives are still focused on 2 suspects, Pamela Phillips and Ron Young. But they still don't have enough evidence to charge either of them, and Ron is still in hiding.
Everybody worked this case down to the last possible lead, and then we were left, where's Ron Young?
In November of 2005, investigators decide to make one last attempt to draw Ron out.
I mean, there's this push that we need to do something on it. The sheriff's department really wants to solve this case.
When the thought of America's Most Wanted came up, it seemed like a logical way to at least try to locate him.
It really hit the national spotlight when it debuted. It just kind of let everybody know to be on the lookout for this man who is a person of interest, Ronald Young.
The episode airs on November 19th. Within 24 hours, Tucson police get the tip they were hoping for.
What happened was Ron Young's chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called in and said, Ron, this guy is a patient of mine, but he's a patient under a different name.
Not only is he a client, but he's got an appointment that morning. So there is this scramble for the fugitive detail in Broward County to set up outside this chiropractor's office. Sure enough, Ron Young comes up in a taxi and is immediately apprehended.
With Ron finally in custody, investigators swiftly execute a search warrant for his apartment and vehicle.
There are boxes and boxes of, all sorts of things, floppy disks, thumb drives, hard drives, paper receipts. There is just this treasure trove of information.
As the recordings were analyzed, as computer was analyzed, it was evident that they had a financial relationship.
The evidence that's becoming clear is that Ron Young is owed $400,000 by Pam Phillips for a job that he did for her.
He's meticulously, like an accountant, kept track of every payment.
Over the course of years, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash that Pam Phillips is sending to Ron Young. That's obviously huge evidence, but it's the phone calls that Ron Young has been recording between the two of them that ultimately is the downfall for both of them.
When investigators listen to the tapes, they immediately recognize the 2 voices.
We took one of the micro cassettes, put it into a recorder, and started to play it, and instantly you heard Ron Young's voice, and he was talking to Pam Phillips.
I can't really talk right now, but I put something in the mail. Thanks, bye.
And the minute I heard her voice, I knew that he was talking on the phone with Pam Phillips. And at that point, I just said, this has got to be the answer. Probably one of the most damning recordings was when there was an argument over the money, how much she was sending or how much she wasn't sending.
I'm like cashless. I need to restructure, reorganize, do something. You know what? I just can't handle this. I really can't. It's too dangerous.
She argues with him, says, I've paid you enough. And Ron Young says, you will pay me the rest of my money or you will be in prison for murder. And her response is, so will you.
That's when I said, okay, we've got him.
But when Aspen police try to arrest Pamela, they discover she's now on the run.
After the indictment came down, they found that she had left for Europe.
What we know is that she took a flight that took her through Atlanta, then on to Gatwick Airport in London, and then possibly on to Munich. And that's all we know.
To track her down, detectives enlist the aid of Interpol.
They start conducting a European investigation on her. And about 1 year later, I get a call, and it's basically Pam is in custody in Vienna, Austria.
The way that they track her down, in a very ironic, almost coincidental scenario, is she stiffs her limousine driver.
She didn't pay him one time, and the guy went to the police there, and that's how she got caught.
She has again found herself a man, a rich man, to align with. And she's living the high life again. She has literally reinvented herself in Vienna, Austria.
On July 2nd, 2010, Pam is finally taken into custody at the Tucson International Airport.
What was reported to me is her comment was, if Gamber's in the airport, I'm not getting off the plane. Then she gets handed over to me. So it was a good feeling.
I kept asking her questions the whole time until she got into the detective's car. And I said, well, how does it feel to be back in Tucson? And she looked at me and she said, it's very hot. Well, it got a lot hotter.
Coming up, Gary's accused killers finally stand trial. But will a jury convict them?
I knew it was only the beginning. The investigation was going to go under a microscope.
Nearly 18 years after the murder of real estate tycoon Gary Triano, prosecutors in Tucson, Arizona have finally charged two co-conspirators with the crime. Gary's ex-wife, Pamela Phillips, and her ex-lover, Ron Young. The trials begin with Ron Young in February of 2010.
The evidence is, the recordings, all the evidence that he'd saved.
He makes a trip to Tucson, and he stalks Gary, and he learns about his habits.
Ron Young had established Gary's pattern of going to the La Paloma Country Club. He constructed the device. He planted it in the car. He sat back and he waited for Gary Triano's golf game to end, and that's when he hit the detonate button.
The public defender's office just said that the state's case was very circumstantial and didn't rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt.
But the jury disagrees. Ron is found guilty.
Ron never admitted to anything. He professed his innocence throughout the trial. It was the jury that came back and decided that he was involved in this.
4 years later, it's Pamela's turn to face a jury.
Before she goes to trial, the judge deemed that she was incompetent to stand trial. So she goes through all these tests and she goes through all this rehabilitation to get her competent to stand trial.
Basically, the prosecution theory of the case is that Ron Young was hired by Pam Phillips to kill Gary Triano.
They wind up getting into an arrangement where Pam convinces Ron that she's got this $2 million life insurance policy, and that if he carries out this hit on Gary, she'll pay him $400,000.
According to the DA, the meticulous notes Ron kept are more than enough proof of Pam's involvement.
She gets the money from the insurance claim early 1997, and she starts paying Ron Young these payments shortly thereafter. We're talking $400,000, and it's being paid out in bits and pieces. You know, it was very suspicious.
He was doing work for her, trying to help her start this business called Star Babies. And he wanted the money sent to him in a wire transactions that were kind of separated and hidden and it looked bad.
But that isn't the only evidence linking Pamela to the murder. On February 27th, prosecutors call a new witness to the stand.
Pam has a best friend of hers, Laura Chapman, who is the prosecution's surprise witness.
After Ron Young's trial and he's convicted, Laura Chapman comes forward.
She says, you know, Pam told me before Gary was murdered that when they were having marital problems, that Pam should just hire a hitman and take him out. That became sort of the smoking gun of Pam Phillips' trial.
However, the defense argues that none of it proves Pam is guilty of murder.
They could never really place her at the scene of the crime, you know, so they have to link her to Ron, and they have to link her through emails and things that can be interpreted differently.
In fact, Pam's attorneys have their own theory about who killed Gary.
The whole defense was geared toward this dead billionaire in Tucson that had a beef with Gary Triano.
The person we think was involved with this case was a guy named Neil McNeese. Neil McNeese had been threatening to kill Gary Triano for a number of years. We all know as trial lawyers that if you do a third-party culpability, it's your story versus the state's theory of the case. It's not about reasonable doubt anymore. It's about whose theory the jury believes.
As the jury deliberates, it's anyone's guess which story they will believe.
You're always nervous about whether or not you were able to come up with enough evidence that the jury would agree with your theory of the case.
On April 8th, 2014, they return with their verdict.
She's guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and first-degree murder. And her sentence is natural life in prison, which in Arizona means that's life without parole.
It wasn't until we got the verdict that I breathed a sigh of relief. That was probably the most gratification that most homicide detectives get on a case.
Gary's children were there, his ex-wife was there, his brother, and there was just this sense of relief. I mean, after almost 2 decades, they finally felt that they got some measure of justice.
An insatiable desire for the finer things in life had driven Pam to gamble on the perfect murder. Instead, she'd lost everything.
There was, I think, some sadness that Pam Phillips, she didn't have to do this. She was not destitute by any means.
Pam orchestrated this murder absolutely out of revenge, but also just plain and simple greed. She was told that she was going to live a lavish lifestyle, be part of the rich and famous, be this elite socialite. It just sort of epitomized the ugly side of American greed. What would somebody do for money?
She was a gorgeous debutante with the world on a string.
She's a beautiful woman in the prime of her life. She really had no enemies.
Her family was well respected, as was she.
Until it was all suddenly taken away.
It was bad, you know. Beautiful entranceway to a beautiful townhome, and there she's laying covered in blood and roses.
This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit.
The investigation would take detectives from a quiet bedroom community in Atlanta to the mansions of Palm Beach, Florida, to expose a killer desperate to be part of high society.
There's old money down there in Palm Beach. It's the rich and the famous.
I remember going to parties where there were bowls of cocaine.
When you have a lot of money, you can buy your way out of a lot of different things.
Friday, January 16th, 1987. It's a quiet morning in Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood when shots ring out along a row of townhouses.
The police were called, and they responded almost immediately.
Officers arrived to find the door of one of the homes left open. Inside the foyer is the body of a 35-year-old woman. She's been shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of blood.
Shootings are uncommon in this upscale community, but police are even more surprised when the victim is identified as socialite Lita McClinton Sullivan.
Lita was such a sweet woman. She was very attractive, tall, beautiful smile, and very warm and very caring.
It really made no sense. She lived in a very nice part of town. She was doing all the right things as a human. She was a great human being. Why would someone want this beautiful woman in the prime of her life who was good to everyone? Why would they want him dead?
Born January 7th, 1952, Lita McClinton grew up among Atlanta's social elite.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Her mother was a state representative, and her father worked for the Federal Department of Transportation. Very upscale, white-collar people. And they lived in an old section of Atlanta, DeKalb County, Georgia. She attended college in the Atlanta area. I believe it was Spelman College.
She did go through debutante training and was a debutante and was a very elegant, beautiful, well-educated woman.
As a socialite, the next logical step was to find a suitable husband. But instead, Lita focused on building a career in fashion.
She just loved the retail business and fashion. And I think her aspiration was to run her own store one day. She was so busy that she was not dating. I never met anybody. Maybe she was just quiet about it and very private.
That all changed the day 34-year-old James Sullivan walked into her life in 1975.
Jim Sullivan was from the Boston area of Massachusetts. He grew up kind of scrappy and hard, for lack of a better term. But he inherited a great deal of money when his uncle died and left him a few liquor stores. The liquor store business drew him to Macon, Georgia, and eventually from Macon, he made his way to Atlanta, which is how he ended up meeting Lita.
Throughout that time period, he became friendly with a lot of the Atlanta socialites.
And he charmed her, evidently, in the store, and they started to date, and she was kind of head over heels.
According to Lita's friends, despite the 11-year difference in age, it was a classic case of opposites attract.
He had money, but was a little rough around the edges and came from Boston, which couldn't be more different than Atlanta, Georgia, especially during that time frame.
He was a terrible dresser, and I know that Lita changed that by just suggesting his ways. He was also very thrifty, so it was a hard job, but she got it done.
She loved that man, and there was something about him that appealed to her. Maybe it was the difference that drew her to him, but there's no logical explanation behind it. But I think the love between her and him was real.
After dating for only a year, Lita and Jim got married in 1976, settling into his house in Macon together. But Jim wanted more for himself and his new bride. He was a social climber who had his sights set on the exclusive island enclave of Palm Beach, Florida.
It's a very influential, very affluent area of Florida. It has lots of money, a lot of socialites.
And Jim had already found the perfect place. Casa Isleta, a historic beachside villa just down the road from Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort.
When Jim bought that big house, everybody noticed. And everybody wants to know who bought that house because it's right on South Ocean Boulevard. It's a beautiful Italian house. Lita thought that she could be very happy. I mean, what's not to love about beautiful homes? And it's a pretty place. I remember their first party where Alan and I were invited. The invitation came in a big piece of chocolate, hand-delivered, with the invitation, with the address and all that. He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. It was his coming-out party.
Around the same time, the couple bought a new townhouse in Atlanta. And for nearly a decade, the couple would split their time between Palm Beach and Buckhead.
She's an Atlanta girl through and through, so Lita wanted to come back home.
They bought a townhouse maybe a mile from where I lived, so I saw her often. But that was Lita's home base, and they went back and forth to Florida.
It seemed as though Lita was getting the best of both worlds, thanks to her husband.
I remember he bought her a Bentley, and I remember Lita would drive it, and then we would all jump in, and it was really a lot of fun. We'd go down Peachtree riding, like 6 of us all riding in this convertible. It was really fun.
She was happy, frequently seeing her family again and her friends, and was enjoying everything that life had for her at age 35.
But when Lita answered her doorbell that January morning, it all came to a bloody end. Now she lies dead in the foyer of her Midtown getaway, and investigators want to know why.
She wasn't a high-risk victim. She didn't do anything that would cause her to become a victim of a violent crime, such as this.
The first thing you ask yourself is, why is this person dead? Who wants this person dead? What is this murder all about?
Coming up, Lita's loved ones say her marriage wasn't everything it appeared to be.
When people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper.
"35-year-old socialite Lita Sullivan has been murdered at her townhouse in Buckhead. Given its high-profile nature, the Atlanta Police Department puts its most decorated detectives on the case.
The lead detective was Welcome Harris, who was himself an icon of the civil rights movement and a very talented homicide detective and also a native Atlantan, who was one of the lead detectives on the Atlanta missing and murdered children's cases.
Early analysis of the crime scene indicates this isn't an attempted robbery, but an orchestrated murder.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of Lita's blood.
It wasn't a burglary. The person didn't come in and ransack the house afterwards. The person came to the door. When she looked, it was just flowers that she could see. She opened the door, and he shot her, point blank.
And so good morning was the last thing that Lita ever said. This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit. She was lured to the door with flowers so that she could be shot in the head.
One of Lita's neighbors says he heard the gunshots, and when he looked outside, he caught a glimpse of the possible shooter.
There was a flower delivery individual. That individual shot and killed Miss Sullivan, and thereafter fled the area.
He was able to give a general description to the Atlanta Police Department, and they were able to do a composite sketch.
But if this was a professional hit, who sent the gunman? And why? Detectives' first call is to Lita's husband, Jim Sullivan.
James Sullivan was in Palm Beach, Florida, at Casa Lita when Lita was murdered.
He is shocked by the news and says he couldn't imagine who could ever want to hurt her. But Lita's devastated parents tell police there were plenty of people who wished her harm. In fact, that's one of the reasons why she'd gotten the house in Buckhead to begin with.
When Lita moved to Palm Beach, it was in the middle of the 80s, of 1980s. Palm Beach was a very white Anglo-Saxon place. If you go to some of the big parties, there are no black people.
The only time you see people of color are the landscape people and the butlers and things like that. It's an island full of mansions, and it's very exclusive.
She was having a hard time. She told me quite a few times that people were rude to her when she walked into a store. They were sort of surprised, like, who are you? And why are you here? Lita was not happy in Palm Beach. She felt like she wasn't treated, so she kept on coming back to Atlanta.
However, Lita's parents say that what concerned them most was the way James had handled the discrimination. When Lita told him she was unhappy, he didn't seem to care.
Like, what'd you bring me here for? I can feel it, I can sense it. I'm not welcome here. This isn't my world.
He didn't worry about Lita. He didn't listen that when people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper. He didn't care about that.
On Palm Beach, they kind of excluded her from all the other things that were going on in Palm Beach. And he wanted to become a force in Palm Beach.
He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. He wanted to take Palm Beach by storm.
I don't think that James Sullivan was welcomed as much as he probably wanted to be. He was trying to work his way into that, and I don't know if that worked out as well as he wanted.
Now you got two strikes against you. You're a white guy who's not blue blood money, you're more blue collar money, and you're married to an African American woman.
Lita's loved ones say that his behavior confirmed what they already suspected about the marriage.
There was tension in between James and his wife. We had received the same information that she had left and come back to the Atlanta area.
She didn't share a lot, but you could tell sometimes that she was by the sound of her voice, or when she'd call and say, let's get together. It was a hard time for her.
And it seems there was another reason for the split as well.
It would get back to me that he would be having lunch with some other woman at the Ritz-Carlton.
Lita Sullivan caught him having an affair, was sleeping with somebody in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. He would embarrass her. She was ridiculed for being a black woman in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. That's when she moved back to Atlanta.
When Jim started attending parties by himself, Lita had already made the decision that she was not staying.
Coming up, could Lita's murder be connected to her impending divorce?
The divorce was coming, but she hadn't yet dealt and told everybody. I mean, people knew, but it was a hard time for her.
Detectives investigating the murder of Lita Sullivan have a promising lead. It seems her marriage to millionaire James Sullivan was in trouble, after she'd discovered he'd been cheating on her.
Palm Beach was where their relationship began to dissolve.
We invited him and Lita over for a small party we were having, and Lita and I were in the library, and Jim was in the living room, and he was asking another guest who was there to go out on a date with him. I think he just thought he could get away with anything.
The police soon discovered that infidelity is only one of James' many flaws.
I learned from her mother that, that they didn't like Jim Sullivan from the beginning. That there's just something about him.
I personally thought he was a phony, and he was a big talker and a big show-off.
I don't know of anybody that was close to him, or if he had any really close friends. Well, other than the women that he ran around with. He was very fond of prostitutes, and he did his own selfies long before our smartphones. He would just put a tripod up and take pictures of himself with these prostitutes and swimming in the pool and such. So he just wasn't a good person.
In the months leading up to Lita's murder, one of James' affairs had apparently become serious.
He became sort of like a couple with this Asian woman, Suki, who then became his date.
Suki and Sullivan began a relationship while he was still married to Lita. And after he and Lita separated, he began pursuing Suki seriously.
For Lita, it was the final straw. Soon after, she filed for divorce, but was gunned down before it could be finalized.
Lita came back to Atlanta and was living in Buckhead. And on the day of her murder, on January 16, 1987, there was a hearing scheduled in Fulton County Superior Court at 2 p.m. where the judge was going to make a final decision on their divorce. Lita had sought to invalidate the terms of their prenuptial agreement and was seeking a settlement. So that's what was on the table on the day that she was murdered.
The timing is incredibly suspicious, but James insists he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He and Lita signed a prenuptial agreement before their wedding 10 years prior, which means he had no financial motive. He thinks Lita was killed because she was living a dangerous double life of her own.
When Lita was killed, what his attorney and Jim made the public believe was that she was in drugs, that it was a drug deal, that it was an old boyfriend that got mad. They tried to ruin Lita's reputation.
Their angle was that it was drug dealers that did it, that she was involved with drugs, and that Jim Sullivan had nothing to do with it.
To Lita's loved ones, the idea that she could have been involved with drugs is ridiculous.
Oh my gosh, Lita didn't even hardly drink. She never did drugs. No.
The accusation adds to the tabloid nature of the story and earns James some new support.
Here in Palm Beach, they didn't really know Lita. They didn't know who her family was, so they basically came to his defense because they didn't know any better. Everything in the news that was printed and on television was that it was her fault. I mean, that's what happens to women. Even after we're dead, we got to prove that we're a nice person.
The media frenzy over the case winds up producing a new lead. Investigators get a tip about 3 suspicious men spotted at a motel near Lita's townhouse the day she was murdered.
They were able to track the killers back to this Howard Johnson motel that they had been in the day before.
And there's witnesses see 3 guys acting weird and getting in a car. It was a rental car, I think. And, they went to the flower store.
When investigators show the motel tipster the composite sketch, it's a match. On the hotel registry, they discover the 3 men had used fake names. However, phone records indicate they made several phone calls. All of them were to a number in Palm Beach, Florida.
They were in Howard Johnson's hotel room, 302, and there was a phone call from that hotel room to Jim Sullivan's house in Palm Beach. And the duration of the call was like 2 minutes or something.
It's enough to convince detectives that James Sullivan has been lying to them about his involvement in his wife's murder. But they still need proof.
It was a circumstantial evidence case. Jim Sullivan didn't pull the trigger. He was hundreds of miles away in Palm Beach at the time.
Coming up, investigators get some help from an unexpected source.
They're getting divorced down here. She tells these stories like, I'm afraid of the guy.
Four months into their investigation, Atlanta police are zeroing in on a suspect in the murder of Lita Sullivan. They believe her estranged husband, James, may have hired a group of hitmen to kill her. James insists that their prenup means he had no motive, but detectives learn that might not have been the case.
She was trying to bust the terms of their prenuptial agreement in order to obtain more of his money that she felt that she was entitled to. He was not only adamantly opposed to it, but was very vocal in his strategy of scorched earth, that if he had to burn all of the assets before she got him, he would be willing to do that.
He didn't think he should have to share anything with Miss Sullivan through the divorce and was trying to preserve his wealth by having her murdered.
If the court ruled in Lita's favor, James stood to lose over $1 million.
She wanted to keep the townhouse in Atlanta. She wanted her car, which was a little two-seater Mercedes, which was not a new car, and she wanted her jewelry. But Jim wanted the jewelry, he wanted the townhouse, and he wanted the car. He wanted everything. He wanted her to walk away with nothing. It was worth $1 million, the settlement. That's all it was.
However, motive is only one piece of the puzzle. Other than a few suspicious phone calls, investigators don't have any solid evidence linking him to the crime. And as the months go on, the chances of finding that proof grow further out of reach.
The Atlanta Police Department in 1987 looked high, looked low, did everything they could in an attempt to solve Lita's murder and could not. They couldn't piece it together.
It was nothing that the Atlanta police did or didn't do that caused the case to go cold. I mean, I think they did an excellent job from the onset. There was a lot of obstacles and there was no cooperation, obviously, from Jim Sullivan.
In the meantime, James has continued to climb the social ladder in Palm Beach.
After Lita was murdered, he was free, of course. So not only did he not have to pay Lita anything after she was murdered, but he was free to marry Suki.
She was enamored with him because he came across the same way he did with Lita, charming.
But in 1989, a routine traffic stop would cause him to lose it all.
He was driving the car, it was the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce, whatever, but he was involved in a minor traffic accident.
He's not supposed to be driving. He doesn't have a license. The tag's on his car. He's so cheap he doesn't even keep the tags current. So he gets a couple citations. He goes to court. The cop doesn't show up. So he gets Suki to testify, Your Honor, I was driving. So they threw the case out. Well, wouldn't you know, a Palm Beach Post reporter, he's in court that day because he's kind of watching Sullivan too. He gets back to his office and calls the police officer and says, Hey, I know you didn't come to court today, but Sullivan had his wife testify that she was driving. He had her stand up in court and swear under oath. Now the cop's hot. So he goes to the state attorney and they start this investigation.
They wind up convicting him of perjury, and he takes a plea, and he was restricted to house arrest for, I guess, a year.
At the same time, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has obtained a warrant to search James and Suki's home.
GBI came down here. He sees a gun in the house. He gets charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon.
They found 4 weapons. One sort of shotgun, which he was not permitted to have while under house arrest.
The gun charge, as well as Suki's false testimony, gives detectives some new leverage in their murder investigation.
They charged Suki with perjury. Now she's freaking out because she's got a felony charge, and so now they're really split.
She just felt like that was just wrong. She didn't do anything, and he was the one that should, face the court.
In 1990, Suki files for divorce and agrees to testify against James. She winds up giving investigators more than they could have ever hoped for.
She says Sullivan basically didn't confess, but said Lita's murder is good for us, which is kind of unusual, you know, telling a woman, my wife was murdered, and it's going to be good for us.
That exclamation caused an intense national publicity.
With Suki's sworn testimony, prosecutors have what they need to present their case against James Sullivan to a grand jury.
He was arrested shortly after that point.
Coming up, charging a multimillionaire with murder is one thing. Convicting him is another.
He hired big-time Washington, D.C. lawyer, and they shut us down.
Five years after the murder of Lita Sullivan, investigators have finally arrested her ex-husband James for planning the crime.
The feds had indicted Sullivan for interstate commerce for committing a crime, namely using the phones to set up this hit, murder. The main witness at the 1992 federal trial was Suki Sullivan. Suki doesn't want to take the hit for him anymore.
But as the trial begins in June of 1992, it quickly becomes clear that their case still isn't strong enough. James has hired an expensive and effective legal team who turned the testimony of his latest ex-wife into a disaster for the prosecution.
Upon cross-examination, she fell apart. They didn't have enough to really nail her, but they had enough to dirty her up really badly, that she was just out to get money from Sullivan.
She pretended that she wasn't understanding or able to read English. She pretended that she was frightened of Mr. Sullivan. And those pretensions by her turned out to be completely false, at least from the court's perspective when the court entered the final judgment.
He was acquitted by a judge. It was a directed verdict in federal court. And he was free after that and just remained at large.
Even if James did hire hitmen to get rid of Lita, it looks like he's going to get away with it. But Lita's well-connected parents decide to take matters into their own hands with a civil lawsuit.
They were looking to sue Sullivan for wrongful death. I think they were a little frustrated with the Atlanta prosecutors. And so we spoke for a while, and I said I'd be happy to take it on. I'm not a lawyer, so I got a good friend of mine who was practicing civil law at the time, Brad Morris, to take a look at it.
James doesn't seem to take the suit seriously, choosing to skip the high-priced lawyers this time.
He fired his attorney and he defended himself.
Mr. Sullivan determined that he would represent himself before the jury and argue his own defense as to why the issues brought by the estate of Lita Sullivan should not be accepted by the jury.
The move immediately backfires.
We go to court and, we really smoked the guy.
There was a judgment against Mr. Sullivan on behalf of the estate of Lita Sullivan for approximately $6 million.
While James has been found legally responsible for his wife's death, it still doesn't guarantee justice.
Lita's parents won a judgment against him, wrongful death. He never paid it. He never ever had any intention of paying 1 cent to anybody.
He was hiding money all over the place. They never collected a penny because they couldn't find it.
He was a criminal. That's how he was brought up. And he was a nasty man.
For the next several years, no criminal charges are placed for Lita's murder, and James Sullivan's notoriety continues to grow.
He always wanted to be in the newspapers, on TV, be talked about. Well, guess what? His wish came true, because now he's in the papers, he's on TV, he's being talked about, and not in a good way.
However, the national publicity would eventually provide detectives with a new lead.
Years later, I think it was America's Most Wanted, did a TV show based on the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In 1998, a woman named Belinda called the GBI and said that she had some information about the murder of Lita in Atlanta in 1987.
She's watching this show and she sees his picture and says, "Oh my God, this guy gave my ex-boyfriend a bag of cash."
She's living in Texas, hasn't seen Harwood in years. He knocks on her door and said, "Oh, I'm just passing through Texas and I thought I'd say hello." This was right after the America's Most Wanted had the Lita murders case on television. This woman had also seen that show. She is wigged out. She thinks Harwood's going to kill her.
For investigators, this cold case has suddenly heated back up.
One of the things that we all had a duty to do was to make sure that she was telling us the truth. And in order to do that, you have to corroborate and investigate every aspect of what she told us. And the GBI, they teamed back up with the Atlanta Police Department. One of the things that she told them was that Tony Harwood had met Jim Sullivan when he was working as a mover for a trucking company. So they went to that company and they were able to locate the original contract from November of 1986, where Tony Harwood, in fact, moved some furniture into Jim Sullivan's home in Palm Beach.
Investigators quickly tracked down Tony Harwood in North Carolina. To their surprise, he seems to be waiting for them.
When they knocked on the door, he said something like, "I was wondering what took you so long."
He admitted to them that he met Jim Sullivan and that Jim Sullivan had hired him to kill his estranged wife and offered to pay him $25,000 to kill Lita. He confirmed that he was in Atlanta at the time that Lita was murdered, but he denied ever pulling the trigger and instead blamed another individual. After they were able to corroborate not only what Belinda said, but what Tony Harwood said with independent evidence, contracts, phone records, other witnesses, they then issued an arrest warrant for Jim Sullivan.
He was re-indicted in Fulton County for the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In most cases, double jeopardy would prevent James from being tried again for the same crime. But it seems he's unwilling to take that chance.
When they attempted to bring him in, Jim Sullivan had already gotten word that there was a warrant for his arrest, and he fled.
He took his passports and left. He got out of the U.S.
Coming up, an international manhunt begins, with James one step ahead of investigators.
He fled from Florida to Costa Rica, and from Costa Rica, he went on a worldwide tour.
An accomplice's confession has given prosecutors another chance to convict James Sullivan. But before he can be arrested, James flees the country. The search continues for several years, but James continues to evade capture. So in 2002, the FBI tries enlisting the aid of the public.
At that time, America's Most Wanted was very popular. We used them as a very good investigative tool to assist us in trying to find people. That night that it was featured, I was there at America's Most Wanted answering phone calls. We started getting a lot of phone calls saying he's in Thailand.
Thailand police immediately placed James under arrest, but the wheels of international justice turn slowly. It takes 2 more years for James to be extradited back to the United States. In the meantime, prosecutors used the delay to prepare their case.
We did everything we could to round up the witnesses, interview the witnesses, prepare the witnesses, prepare our physical evidence, make sure we had everything tested and everything investigated. We had to go about finding people and interviewing people who hadn't spoken of her murder for years, decades. Tony Harwood entered into a negotiated plea with the state of Georgia, and what he agreed to do was to serve 20 years in prison for his role in the death of Lita in exchange for testifying against Jim Sullivan at trial.
It probably prevented him from getting the death penalty.
When James arrives in 2004, his attorneys immediately file a motion to dismiss the charges. It goes all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court for a decision.
He tried to block his trial by saying double jeopardy, that the federal government had prosecuted him for this crime already and he had been acquitted, and therefore the state of Georgia could not try him for this crime. He lost that appeal to the Supreme Court.
In 2006, 19 years after Lita was assassinated, James Sullivan finally stands trial in Georgia. Although prosecutors have first-hand testimony from one of the hitmen James hired, the defense argues that there is no actual evidence he was involved.
We could never place any firearms, at least a 9mm, in Harwood's possession. Never got any hits back on the shell casings. He says that, he threw it out the window for the guy. I think he said his name was Bob or something.
The defense blamed it all on Tony Harwood. Basically, Harwood is a liar, and you can't believe anything he has to say, and the state just didn't prove their case. And they're just blaming Sullivan because he's the usual suspect, the estranged ex-husband.
But the state's case proves strong enough to prevent James from escaping for a second time.
Ma'am, would you publish the verdict?
It took the jury a few hours to deliberate.
We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder.
And find Jim Sullivan guilty of Lita's murder. Then the jury affixed the penalty at life without the possibility of parole.
Everybody was elated, especially the family, all the people that worked so hard on the investigation, the Atlanta Police Department, the GBI, everybody that was involved with this.
When I heard the verdict, I thought that show-off of a man who only talked about all the places he had and he lived and the clothes he had, now is going to have to spend the rest of his life in this prison, in this beat-up old uniform.
It seems a fitting end for such a notorious social climber. The same callousness and greed that drove James to have Lita killed wound up putting him in jail for the rest of his life.
Jim killed Lita because he couldn't part with 1 cent. She was not going to get that condominium, that car, and the jewelry. It was just power. It was just power and greed. That's all. She was not going to win.
Justice was served. I'd have much rather Mr. Sullivan receive the death penalty because of what he did. But him staying in jail for the remainder of his life doesn't bring back Miss Sullivan.
And I always think of the possibilities of the woman she could have been. She would be about 68 now, I believe. What she could have done, she would have remarried, had children. I mean, that's what she wanted. She never got to fulfill all her dreams.
There may be some money out there. The best vengeance was to get that money and then give it to the McClintons to donate somewhere, because I'm sure they'd donate it. That would be the best vengeance for me anyways.
were a wealthy California family living the perfect life.
They were well-connected, very successful, wonderful people.
Until it was all shattered by unimaginable violence.
People slain in their own home on Easter Sunday. That was a shock.
This case was like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle.
The investigation would take detectives on a 3-year manhunt ranging from the farms of Fresno to international drug cartels to catch a killer driven by greed.
Some referred to it as Fresno County's crime of the century.
You just couldn't imagine the level of evilness.
April 21st, 1992. Around 9 a.m., police in Fresno, California receive a panicked call from the housekeeper of a local millionaire, 59-year-old businessman Dale Ewell.
Housekeeper Juanita Avita arrived at her usual time. She came into the house and she immediately noticed that a door that leads to the kitchen was closed, which was highly unusual. She went in and at that point saw Tiffany laying face down in a puddle of blood. She then ran over to the neighbor's house and the police were called.
Tiffany Ewell is Dale's 24-year-old daughter. When officers arrive, they immediately see she's been dead for some time.
When we first went inside, you could see as you walked into the kitchen the body of Tiffany. She was laying down with her head kind of pointed towards the southeast next to the dining room table. We surmised that she had been shot in the back of the head, just from where the blood was.
But when police search the rest of the house, they discover Tiffany is not the only victim.
There's a hallway that goes to the east from the dining room. And as we walked that way, it went into like a den or a study area. You could see the body of Glee. And as we walked that direction, you could see that the body of Dale was laying in another hallway just outside the den. He had a bunch of newspapers in his hand underneath him and around him.
They discovered it was not one death, but 3.
Tiffany, her 57-year-old mother Glee, and her father Dale have all been shot. But why would anyone murder a family like the Ewells?
The family was a very prominent family in Fresno County. They were well-connected, very successful, wonderful people, and by all counts, a happy family.
Dale was a retired Air Force pilot from Ohio, and Glee was a former teacher. They'd gotten married in 1961 and moved to California to start a new life together.
Dale was involved in airplane business and made a good living through that as well as through farming. His wife Glee was known for being involved in the community as a volunteer in different ways.
In 1967, Glee gave birth to their first child, Tiffany. Their son Dana came 4 years later in 1971. By then, Dale had become so successful that he invested in agricultural real estate. He soon amassed an $8 million fortune. Glee quit teaching to devote her time to philanthropy.
Glee was a community activist, just a wonderful person who did a great deal of volunteer work within the community.
Glee was a force of nature in a very nice way. She was an appointee to the State Bar Board of Governors. She also became the executive director of the Fresno Regional Foundation.
Everybody seemed to, in most circles, know either Dale or Glee. They were very successful in what they did.
But you'd never know the Ewells were millionaires by looking at them.
Fresno is a great community. We are based in agriculture. Everyone in the community is either a farmer, works for a farmer, or had family that was a farmer.
The Ewells had more wealth than most people in Fresno, and being able to fly airplanes and drive Mercedes and that sort of thing. But, aside from those kinds of trappings, I wouldn't call them a flashy family.
The Ewells did not flaunt their wealth at all. For the amount of money that they were worth, they were very, very conservative.
They made sure their children were given the opportunity to succeed as well. By 1992, Tiffany was a grad student at Fresno State, while Dana was studying business at Santa Clara University.
Lee's children, I gathered, were a bit different. Tiffany, their daughter, was far more quiet, reserved, but wonderful in her way. And Lee would speak glowingly about her.
She was just a very nice young lady who was reserved, did not have a ton of friends that she would socialize with. She was more family-oriented, but everybody who knew her seemed to like her.
Dana was clearly the apple of Lee's eye. She spoke with great passion about his outgoing personality, his intellectual capabilities, his business acumen.
Dana stood out as a intense, well-groomed, corporate type of young man.
Dale and Dana had a fairly good father-son relationship. They were, by all counts, a happy family.
But now, 3 members of the Ewell family have been brutally murdered, and Fresno police are determined to find out why.
It was what we call a triple, in the fact that this was an affluent family in a decent part of town, and not your typical victims. So the whole unit responded out to this particular scene.
Coming up, if someone is targeting the Ewell family, could Dana be next?
We didn't know if Dana Ewell was still alive. We didn't know if he had not been massacred somewhere between their house and wherever he was. We just didn't know.
Millionaire Dale Ewell, his wife Glee, and their daughter Tiffany have been murdered in their Fresno, California home. And as investigators search the crime scene, the evidence begins to paint a disturbing picture.
A homicide scene tells a story, and this one told a pretty clear story.
The way the bodies were all spread out, it kind of gave us an idea on how the crime had gone down.
It was clear that Tiffany was killed first, that she did not know what was coming. She was just standing in the kitchen and got shot in the back of the head.
She was probably dead before she hit the floor. We believe that Glee saw this happen and actually saw the killer.
Glee then ran from Tiffany's killer, ran into a den that she was shot multiple times.
As she laid on the ground on her side, the killer stood above her, and she actually looked up at him and was trying to basically, I guess, say no. And he shot her again while standing above her.
She had her keys in her hand and in death had a look of fright on her face.
After shooting the 2 women, it appears the killer then ambushed Dale.
As he's walking down the hallway, the killer comes out from a bedroom and shoots him once in the head. And I think he was dead before he hit the ground also.
The blood has dried, which tells police the attack occurred some time ago. But was it the result of a robbery gone wrong, or something else?
There was a box of 9mm shells in the nightstand in the master bedroom. And apparently Dale had a gun that went with that, a 9mm handgun, that was missing.
The home had been ransacked quite a bit, and so the initial thought was that this could be a burglary. But upon closer inspection, there were a lot of inconsistencies with the burglary.
We scoured the house, every entryway, every nook and cranny that anybody could get through that house. No signs of forced entry, the way the drawers were opened and then closed. Burglars didn't do that. You leave them open so you don't touch them twice. It was, we felt, to make it look like a burglary had occurred and that Glee and Tiffany and Dale had interrupted a burglar.
In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that whoever did this was a professional.
Normally, we would expect to find just hair strands, fingerprints, a point of entry. It was incredible how little forensics was able to find in a 4-day inspection.
We really didn't find much of anything except the expended rounds. The precision of the shots, especially to Tiffany and Dale, one shot to the head, this is a hit.
But why would a killer target Dale and his family on Easter weekend? When investigators talked to neighbors, they learned the Ewells spent the holiday weekend at their beach house in nearby Pajaro Dunes. Their son Dana had returned from college to go with them.
We didn't know there was a family member missing until we did some interviews with some people who knew the family. We're concerned that maybe he's to be another victim.
At the time of the murders, Dana was a student at Santa Clara University. Law enforcement had to follow up to make sure that he was safe.
Thankfully, they find Dana safe at school. He flies back to Fresno to speak with investigators.
Dana had said he was trying to reach the family and couldn't.
He did not react in a way that one would expect. He didn't shed tears over it.
Didn't show any emotion. And part of that could have been shock.
Do you know of any reason why anybody would want your family dead? Nothing, sir.
And he said that he didn't know of anyone who would want his family dead, other than saying that his father was involved with some pretty high-level individuals, and he didn't know if any of those people could have wanted his family dead.
Dana tells investigators he last saw his family 2 days ago at Easter dinner. He brought his girlfriend and her family to meet them.
He's dating at the time the daughter of an FBI agent in San Jose.
They invited them to dinner there at the beach house. So there's Dana and Monica, his girlfriend, and then her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zent. It was apparently a great dinner, and then when they all left,
Dana went back with the Zents to their home. Dale flew home, and Glee and Tiffany drove home.
Dale didn't like all of them flying together or all of them driving together because he was worried that if something were to happen, he didn't want the whole family to die together. He wanted somebody to be alive.
Ironically, that meant Dale would arrive too late to save his wife and daughter. By the time he gets home, his family members have already been killed. But detectives find the timing rather curious.
Tiffany and Glee had gotten home first. When they got into the dining room, the killer was waiting in the family room just around a corner.
Approximately 30 minutes later, Dale ended up coming home through the garage. Why would a person who just committed 2 murders wait 30 to 40 minutes for somebody else to come home? That was very strange.
Coming up, investigators discovered that the Ewells had some powerful enemies.
These people were targeted to die, period. That gets you back to the question, who benefits by this hit?
Three members of the Ewell family have been murdered during the Easter holidays. Police believe the gunman had access to the house, but the sole survivor, the Ewell's son Dana, has an airtight alibi.
At the time of the murders, he's with the FBI agent's family, hours away from the Ewell home.
They checked out everything he had said, and he had been with Monica over in the Santa Clara area.
The autopsy report provides investigators with a few more cryptic clues.
The pathologists recovered the bullets from the bodies, and the bullets looked like something that law enforcement, at least in Fresno, had never seen before.
Some of the expended rounds that we had found in Glee had some really unique striation marks.
The detectives put quite a bit of work into figuring out what could possibly have made those striations.
The bullets turned out to be a match for the ones found on the nightstand in Dale and Glee's bedroom.
We believe that the killer knew that those rounds were there, used those rounds to load up his gun, and committed the murders, and then stole the 9mm also.
There are also traces of a strange substance.
One of the other things we found were microscopic little bitty pieces of yellow fuzz, if you will. Little pieces of yellow material on Glee's clothing. We didn't know what that was.
The evidence only raises more questions. But by now, the triple homicide has made the news, and Fresno police feel the pressure to come up with answers.
It was a case that, frankly, fascinated me. I watched it in the news. I reviewed all the media and wondered where this case was going to end up.
We had to find a motive. So they started to look into backgrounds of Dale, Glee, and Tiffany to see what they could find out. Talking to family members, talking to friends, talking to whoever, find out what they were into.
Dana spoke highly of Tiffany and said that she was a harmless creature and that he couldn't think of anyone who would possibly want to hurt Tiffany.
She was Daddy's little girl. She was very protected by her parents. She had apparently been in an accident when she was younger and received some trauma to her brain. And from everything we could find, she didn't have a mean bone in her body. There was no reason why she needed to be killed.
During the course of the investigation, authorities discover that Glee hadn't always been an unassuming teacher.
Earlier in her life, she had worked for the CIA. And I went, wow, well, that's a big deal. So that was something they looked into. And it turned out not to be a covert type of position in the CIA. It was something a little less glamorous.
In recent years, she'd become an outspoken civic activist. Was it possible she'd made enemies of the wrong people?
Glee was in a position of power, serving on a high-level state bar committee, and was involved in decision-making that could have led someone to become very upset with her.
People do crazy things, and we didn't know if maybe someone who wanted to be a judge got passed over and just got fed up with it.
We had to eliminate those people as possible suspects.
As investigators dig further, they find out Dale was in business with some dangerous people as well.
He took over a business from a guy who went to prison.
The person who owned Western Piper apparently had gotten some problems with running drugs with planes, and Dale swooped in and bought the company out from under him. The detectives were wondering at the time, is he mad that he lost this business the way he did?
Were the Ewells executed on the orders of a drug runner?
There was a lot of territorial gang violence where gangs were fighting over where the lines were drawn for their territory.
We had the Bloods, we had the Crips, we have NF, or Nuestra Familia. We had an influx of Asian gangs when the Hmongs came into the Central Valley, and a lot of them settled in the Fresno area. But one of our biggest problems was the Bulldog gang. They've been a thorn in the side of law enforcement for a long time in this area. They were kind of independent from everybody else, and there's different sects. They really have no hierarchy. They fight each other. They've been a problem in the Fresno County area for a long time.
Gang murders were pretty much at an all-time high. I believe the murders that year were over 100.
Detectives learned that Dale's plane was stolen the day after the murders. They immediately put out an alert, hoping it might connect them to the cartels. But instead, the lead takes them somewhere unexpected.
Dale apparently had a plane at Western Piper who belonged to an attorney out of Las Vegas. And apparently the plane had needed some work done. The attorney had actually gone and got his plane. He went and jumped in and got his plane out of there. The timing was really bad on the attorney's part. That's something that they talked to him about. He was interviewed, and that was put to rest.
Fresno police have hit a dead end at every turn so far. But have they been asking the right questions?
All the possible motives, it really comes back to who's going to benefit from this.
Coming up, one name keeps coming back to the top of their list.
He studied billionaires. He wrote to billionaires. He asked for jobs with people who were billionaires.
Detectives investigating the Ewell family murders have been unable to come up with any solid leads, but they soon realized that they looked past one suspect a little too early.
Who stands to gain the amount of money that these people are worth? And that came back to Dana.
As the sole surviving family member, Dana stands to inherit Dale and Glee's entire $8 million estate. But is he capable of murder?
Dana's personality was completely the opposite of anybody in his immediate family. I would describe him as eccentric. When he was in high school, he would wear suits and carry a briefcase. He would flash money. He would buy girls that he liked expensive bottles of perfume. Everybody in the school was aware of Dana Ewell and his love for money.
He kept a collection of billionaires. You know, most kids his age are collecting baseball and football cards, and here he is. His idea of, collecting memorabilia was about people who had become billionaires and millionaires.
He studied billionaires. He wrote to billionaires. We even had some of the copies of letters. We refer to it as the billionaire collection.
He was clearly aiming for a position of prominence in the world and wanted to be regarded as a wealthy businessman.
Investigators have already confirmed Dana was nowhere near his family's home the day of the murders. But his behavior begins to raise suspicion, starting with the funerals.
He was very cheap about buying coffins for his family members, and the way he reacted at the funeral by treating it more like a social event than the way that you would expect any normal human being to act.
He was working the room. He commented on a lady's diamond ring. He was not acting like the grieving son. As detectives, that's where your spidey senses start to come in. Not only did he do that, but he didn't want to cooperate with us anymore. He actually got an attorney, and he wanted us to go through his attorney to talk to him, and which was really bizarre for a sole survivor of a family. Your family's been murdered. You don't want to work with the law enforcement agency that's trying to solve the case.
He acts even more strangely at the reading of the will.
Dana found out for the first time that his father had set up the trust so that he would not get any money until he was 35, which was more than a decade away.
He jumped up and he slammed his hand on the table and he said, "Why did my father do this to me?" And that shocked everyone. Dale's brothers, they said this isn't right, and they brought their concerns to Detective Souza and Detective Burke at that time.
Greed is a powerful motive, and police know that Dana didn't have to pull the trigger himself to be involved.
There are the allegations that young Dana Ewell wants to inherit $7 or $8 million from his parents. He's willing to hire a gunman to kill his mother, his father, his sister on Easter Sunday.
There was a lot of investigation to do up in Santa Clara regarding Dana and just finding out about him and what he was all about.
Classmates tell detectives they should speak with Dana's best friend, Joel Radovich.
It was a weird friendship because Joel was diametrically different than Dana. Dana, this arrogant $1,000 suit rich boy, and Joel, the scrubby, sleeps wherever he can find a place, rides a skateboard, new wave hippie type.
His whole contention that he wasn't really close with Dana and, saw him a little bit, but, they weren't really that as tight as people on campus had made them out to be.
Joel confirms everything Dana told them, but detectives soon discover that both young men are lying.
Now we've got two people that people say are really close, and they're both saying, no, they're not really close. And one of the detectives happened to see Joel driving down the freeway, and he followed him, and he was actually staying at Dana's house.
The hallway still had blood and gray matter from Dale's brain on the sides of the walls. So on a daily basis, Dana and Joel are walking past the blood and gray matter from Dana's father as if it's no big deal.
When we started to key on Dana and Joel as having something to do with the homicides is when we decided to start setting up the surveillances.
For someone unemployed, Joel seems to be living very well.
Dana paid for Joel's helicopter flight lessons in Fresno and didn't even hide it. We were able to show that Dana withdrew $125,000 in cash, that Joel spent about $75,000 in cash.
But Joel hasn't spent all of the money on flight lessons. He's also bought several books that investigators find incriminating.
Books that we were able to discover that Joel obtained was a book called Hitman. It was how you do your job as a professional hitman. It was generally pretty well written, but it had horrible pieces of advice in it. One was, if you are questioned by police, ask, "Are you going to arrest me?" That's exactly what Joel did.
The manual also contains instructions on how to build a silencer.
That coupled with taking the flying lessons, I think he wanted to be an international hitman. You know, I don't know. I don't think he had any other goal in life.
Coming up, investigators believe they've found their gunman. Now they just have to prove it.
We have to put together a really strong case because neither of these individuals had any history of violence.
After a year of investigation, Fresno police are tracking two suspects in the brutal murders of the Ewell family. Dale Inglee's wealth-obsessed son, Dana, and his best friend, Joel, who's been studying to be a hitman. At this point, gone back to school in Santa Clara, and Joel has moved to L.A.
The way they would get a hold of each other was to page each other.
Think back to the early 90s, so we're talking about people still using payphones, people still using pagers.
To keep tabs on the pair, detectives obtain a warrant to clone Joel's pager.
Every time Joel would get a page from Dana, we would get the same page.
There were a couple payphones located at a location not too far from where he lived, and he would go to that location. They were able to basically have all of these different vehicles following Joel and communicating over the radio as to who would take over next. And if you were an expert in surveillance and you were being followed by this group, you would never have known it.
When they started talking, we could send a detective up with a tape recorder in a backpack and go to the other phone and just act like he was having a conversation, hope to get Joel's side of the conversation.
The recordings seem to confirm police suspicions.
He referred to the three-shirt deal, meaning the three family members, and that he needed money and he needed to get out of town.
He actually said, "I want my money and I want it now," because things were stretching out so long. Dana was extremely careful on where he would go, what payphones he would go to, unlike Joel. So it was a little more difficult to get Dana's side of the conversation.
So on May 13th, 1993, investigators paid Dana a visit to try and rattle him.
So they decided to go to Santa Clara University and knock on Dana's dorm door. And Chris Curtis looked at him and said, "We know who killed your family. It was Joel Radosich." Dana then immediately shut the door in Detective Curtis's face.
As soon as we told Dana that we think Joel killed his parents, Dana leaves campus and paged Joel. And that's when things really started to ramp up.
The surveillance team follows Joel to a restaurant in Ontario, California, where they observe him talking to a bartender named Jack Ponce. Detectives want to know why.
Jack Ponce was about the same age as Joel. He and Joel had been friends since they were children.
We need to go and talk to Jack Ponce. Interviewing him was like pulling teeth.
Ponce denies any knowledge of the murders, but after several visits, investigators eventually get him to open up.
You mentioned that the 380. Let's go back to that. The 380 was yours. The 22 was yours. Actually, not the 22.
I remember asking him early on if he had a 9mm. He said no, he didn't. I think it was the fifth interview, finally. He goes, I bought a 9mm. I go, what kind of 9mm did you have? Oh, it's an 18-9. It's a really nasty-looking gun. He said he had bought it to shoot squirrels in the attic, which was quite a gun to shoot squirrels with.
Ponce conveniently claims that the gun had been stolen. Hoping to prove it was the murder weapon, investigators compare several AT-9 barrels with the bullet markings from the crime scene.
It just turns out that this particular gun had a very unique twist in the barrel.
The criminalists then recreated the exact silencer that the book described, got an AT-9, and then fired numerous rounds through that silencer.
And that silencer is made with PVC pipe, and you stack it with tennis balls and steel wool. The striation mark came out. They were almost identical to the striation marks on the bullets that were recovered in Glee's body.
The test also explains the fuzzy material found on Glee's clothing.
The fuzz was pieces of tennis ball. The little yellow tennis balls.
Ponce is immediately arrested. It doesn't take him long to turn on Joel Radovich.
He basically spilled it that he had bought the gun, and for Joel.
Ponce says Joel told him exactly how he committed the murders while they were getting rid of the gun.
Joel made the decision to tell Jack what happened. Not because he was confessing, but because you're in this too, buddy, and you need to keep your mouth shut.
Joel said, I shaved all the hair off my body except for my eyelashes and my eyebrows so I wouldn't leave any trace, and I was sitting on a plastic sheet waiting for the three to come home.
There were so many different facts that Jack Ponce knew that he couldn't have known on his own through the media or from anybody but Joel Radovich.
That level of planning that went into the murders was just something that Fresno hadn't experienced.
Ponce even agrees to show investigators where to find the murder weapon.
Joel gave a bag of gun parts, the murder weapon plus the 9mm that was stolen from the scene, to Jack Ponce to get rid of. Jack said he had thrown the parts at a variety of places down in San Fernando Valley, and the barrel of the murder weapon, he said he buried it in a vacant lot in Reseda.
3 years after the murders, who knows at that point if an apartment building or a house has been built on that lot.
He's handcuffed and shackled. He looks down, he goes, right about here. 2 shovels full, we hit something. Started digging around, it was the barrel. You get that piece of information that you know, that aha moment when you go, this son of a bitch did it.
Coming up, investigators are close to making arrests. But will the rich kid get away with murder?
People will look on the outside and say, well, this will be an easy trial. It was not an easy trial.
Bartender Jack Ponce has confessed to participating in a plot to kill millionaire Dale Ewell and his family. And according to Ponce, 21-year-old Dana Ewell was the one pulling the strings.
He was really a turning point in that case, explaining how Dana devised the plan, how he recruited Joel, and how the whole case unfolded. There was an estate worth $7 or $8 million that he reasoned he would collect if there were no other heirs in front of him.
It takes detectives some time to gather all the evidence, but on March 2nd, 1995, the 2 remaining conspirators are finally arrested.
It took 3 years before investigators could arrest Dana and Joel. Part of that is Dana's alibi, backed up by an FBI agent.
We had to continue the investigation for much longer than would normally be done if the individuals were the types that had a significant criminal history. It would be difficult for a jury to find beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed such heinous murders.
It was 3 counts of murder with 3 special circumstances, so it was a death penalty case.
A string of motions and appeals tie up the case for several more years. Prosecutors used the time to build a stronger case.
This case was like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There were 162 witnesses who testified in this trial. It was building block upon building block.
They laid out a very clear timeline of how Dana organized it with his friend Joel. He provided himself an alibi by going and seeing his girlfriend and having dinner with her family, and her father was an FBI agent.
In 1997, Dana Ewell and Joel Radovich stand trial. Prosecutors come armed with a money trail they use to argue that Dana paid to have his family killed.
We were able to show that Joel was given $125,000 in cash by Dana for no apparent reason other than tying him to the murders.
Joel wants to be a hitman. Then you look at Dana, and he hires everybody to do his dirty work. Throwing the money out there.
Their star witness, Jack Ponce, provides the jury with all the details of the plot. But the defense argues that Ponce is an unreliable witness who is only implicating Dana in exchange for immunity.
Anytime a witness is given immunity, their credibility is going to be suspect.
Dana's attorneys took the tack that you can't believe a word that Ponce says.
His testimony was something I thought should have been inadmissible, but it was, Joel Radovich told me that Dana Ewell told him, and so you had what's called double hearsay. So the prosecution had to offer an exception, double exception to the hearsay rule there in order to introduce that.
While Dana may be guilty of choosing the wrong friends, the defense insists there is no actual evidence linking him to the crimes.
They had what you would call guilt by association, the relationship between my client and Joel Radovich. So they had, them living together after the murders at the Ewell residence for a while, the paying for helicopter flying lessons, guilt by association evidence.
After an 8-month trial, the jury finally renders a verdict.
It may have been one of the longest deliberations in a criminal case in Fresno County history.
We returned guilty on all counts and also guilty on all enhancements and allegations.
Some people cried, some people laughed, a whole range of emotions because it was such a long case.
However, there's one thing the jury can't agree on.
In California, it has to be a unanimous death verdict. This wasn't, so that left them with the only thing of life without parole, which is mandatory on a death case if the jury can't decide on death. I was extremely glad that I didn't have to sign that verdict as the foreman sentencing them to death. I was very relieved. Now, I had voted the death penalty, but I was glad I didn't have to sign that paper with my name.
To investigators, it's a fitting sentence. In his greed, Dana Ewell had been willing to do anything to become a billionaire. Instead, he destroyed his family and lost everything, including his freedom.
To see a family massacred and then ultimately by a child strips away a bit of the veneer of our comfort, of our society.
I really believe that Dana had a short circuit or a disconnect. He was arrogant. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. To this day, I have no sympathy for him whatsoever.
This guy's a perfect psychopath.
I have always thought, at least for Dana, that the worst day of his life was not the day that he was arrested. The worst day of his life was not the day he was convicted. The worst day was the day his last appeal expired. And now he knows every day for the rest of his life, his home is prison.
What dark impulse led to such violence that night?
One of them saw them in bed together.
When the police officer got there to question her, she was surrounded by candles and photographs.
They realized there was something very different going on.
It's unfortunate, it's terrible that it happened here, and I think it's happened before and it'll happen again.
October 2nd, 1999, Westlake Hills, Texas. It's early Saturday morning in this suburban community of 3,000, just minutes away from Austin.
It's a very upscale, very low crime area. Unusual to have really very many calls for service at all in that area.
But several hours before dawn, Deputy Greg Truitt's radio crackles to life.
It was like 2:30, 3 in the morning. I was driving just outside the city of Westlake in the Travis County area, and a call came out. A man called 911 saying that he woke.
He said to the operator he didn't know had exploded and his guts were spilling out.
They get the ambulance cruising route. I was very close. Another deputy and I arrived at the residence at the same time.
It's a very nice house. It was an architect-designed house. It was a split level, very nice place on a large tract of land, almost on a hilltop, very secluded.
We knock on the door, no answer. So we began just doing a perimeter check of the house, and sure enough, the first windows and door we come to were the bedroom where the caller was in bed, still on his phone when we got there. I think he was still talking to the dispatchers. And he's clenching his hands over his stomach, which was very large. That's when a lady appeared from the other portion of the house in night clothes.
The man in distress is an Austin media mogul and millionaire named Stephen Beard. The woman, Stephen's wife Celeste, is soon joined by her teenage daughter Christina.
They were asleep on the other side of the house, which is a rather large home.
They heard the sirens and saw the flashing lights. And that's when they learned that something had happened to Stephen.
She just immediately started screaming, "Don't let him die, don't let him die." I mean, just pleading with us to handle the problem, whatever it was.
75-year-old Stephen Beard didn't start life as a millionaire.
Steve grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and not a wealthy family, and he was trained and taught and believed in hard work. Eventually, he worked his way up into advertising, and then eventually he decided that he wanted to start a TV station.
He was a self-made man. He started a television station from scratch in Austin and built it up to be one of the major television stations in Austin, and sold it at a tremendous profit.
After Steve sold the TV station, he became a multi-millionaire. I think the TV station sold for about $54 million. He got about a third of that. But then he also had some nice real estate.
But despite his millions, by 1993, Stephen had experienced his share of hardship.
His wife, the mother of his children, died of cancer.
After her death, he was heartbroken, but his kids loved him and surrounded him. His friends loved him and surrounded him.
One of those friends was 32-year-old Celeste Martinez, who Stephen met during his wife's long illness.
He would go to the Austin Country Club, where he was a member, and have dinner, and that was his time to see people. Celeste was a waitress then at the Austin Country Club, and that's how they originally met. And they quickly went from talking to dating in a very short time.
He was, by every description of his friends, funny and fun. Celeste is a very attractive woman, blonde, bubbly, funny,
and I think they just hit it off very well.
They did not date for very long before they were married at the same country club where Stephen Beard had met then Celeste Martinez.
The whirlwind romance caught friends and family by surprise, but the couple didn't care.
There was a major age difference between them, but they were in love. He loved her, she loved him.
He was about 70 years old, and she was in her early 30s. He was very drawn to this person who made him happy and made him feel good.
He was a person who had a big personality, enjoyed life, enjoyed being with his friends and family.
Stephen felt so strongly about family that he formally adopted Celeste's teenage twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer.
This was just something that Stephen wanted to do and wanted to make it clear to them that they were part of his family.
They called him Big Daddy. That was what his co-workers and friends called him, was Big Daddy.
To house his new family, Big Daddy built a magnificent new mansion in Westlake Hills.
It was opulent, and the stone walls, it just felt so safe and secure, just like a fairy book setting.
And Celeste Beard was the Cinderella at the center of it all.
Stephen doted on Celeste, and Stephen loved being able to make her happy.
But now, Celeste's happily ever after has turned into a nightmare.
Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to ambulances and police and finding that your husband, something terrible had happened to him. She was hysterical.
This man must have meant the world to her because the tone of her voice and everything was just so serious and scared, truly scared.
And the situation was about to get even more frightening.
As the medical crew were switching him from the bed to the stretchers for transport, they discovered a shotgun shell in the bedding.
At that point, things changed drastically.
180 degrees from a medical emergency to a violent crime scene.
Coming up, is there more bloodshed to come?
For all we knew, there could be bad guys in this house still.
Police responding to a 911 call from millionaire media mogul Stephen Beard have just found a spent shotgun shell in the injured man's bed.
It came out originally as a medical call. Then they realized that something else was going on, that instead he had actually been shot.
He's alert and conscious and talking to us, and so that's why I just kept going back in my head that, you know, he must have had a surgery and they had split open or something like that. I could see medical equipment beside his bed. He might have had a breathing tube providing oxygen or something. So it just reinforced to me that he was under medical duress.
It did seem so strange that he would call 911 and not have an accurate comprehension of what had occurred to him. He was probably asleep. And it was the pain that woke him up as opposed to the sound of the gun or anything.
Beard's wife Celeste and her daughter Christina appeared just as baffled as the police.
Miss Beard didn't sleep in the same bedroom as her husband.
The home had a wing with a separate bedroom for Celeste, where she slept often, because Stephen had, among other medical problems, COPD, a breathing difficulty, and he slept with a breathing machine. So the first thing that they knew was there were sirens and red lights flashing.
While EMTs rush Stephen to the hospital, police go through the mansion room by room.
For all we knew, there could be bad guys or whatever in this house still, and now we have to do a orchestrated point-by-point search of the house. And at the same time we're checking for bad guys, we're looking for evidence.
Deputies don't find any intruders or signs of forced entry.
It appeared that the door was unlocked, which was somewhat unusual, although people leave their doors unlocked far more often than law enforcement wishes they would.
Jewelry boxes on the vanities did not appear to be pilfered. There was lots of jewelry present. There was closets full of high-end clothing. There was artwork, statues, obvious artifacts and trinkets that would be valuable left undisturbed.
Robbery's not the motive, or burglary's not the motive. They began to think that it was someone who had come there for the sole purpose of shooting Stephen Beard. So if he was the target, then why would it be that someone would target this man?
While CSI processes the house, investigators begin to question witnesses and the victim.
The detectives that respond to the scene, several, go to the hospital and interview Stephen Beard. We had probably 2 at the house interviewing people.
However, none of the witnesses, including Stephen, offer any possible leads.
He couldn't understand why he would be shot. It wasn't like he, upon realizing that it actually was a gunshot wound, that, he immediately gave us a list of people to look at.
There wasn't any talk of having enemies or anyone having idea who would do something like this or why they would do that. He was a respected man in the community, a successful guy, so everything was a mystery.
He didn't appear to be someone who would have anyone who would have some sort of vengeance against him, some reason to harm him. So then you start, looking to see what could this possibly be.
Investigators also question Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, who'd been staying with friends the night of the shooting.
The other daughter came in, that morning. As soon as she was notified, she returned to the house.
She was upset and, concerned about whether or not he would survive.
Jennifer's too distraught to give investigators much information. But as word of the shooting spreads and friends and family gather to support Celeste and her daughters, the shooting investigation takes a sudden turn.
One of the friends approached us and they gave us a name and suggested that it might be something that deserved to be looked into.
They thought that they had a suspect and that it was a young woman who had contact with Celeste Beard in the past.
The woman's name is Tracy Tarleton. And when investigators follow up with Celeste's daughters, they confirm that there was no love lost between Tracy and their adopted dad.
Stephen did not approve of Tracy Tarleton, and Stephen was pretty perceptive about what he thought Tracy Tarleton was after, and that is Tracy Tarleton was after Celeste.
Coming up, did a love triangle become a ticking time bomb?
What we found was that she had, and this is her word, recruited married women who were not happy to be her lovers.
While doctors fight to save millionaire Stephen Beard, gravely injured by a shotgun blast while he slept in his mansion outside Austin, Texas, investigators have just uncovered a possible lead on the shooter's identity.
Someone at the scene that morning voiced a concern about a specific person and provided us what probably was our first lead.
Acting on the tip, detectives take a closer look at a 59-year-old Austin woman named Tracy Tarleton.
Tracy was a manager of Book People. It's a large, very popular bookstore in downtown Austin.
Tracy met Stephen Beard's wife Celeste at a local psychiatric facility several months before the shooting.
Celeste suffered from depression, And she did check into a psychiatric hospital a couple of times, dealing with her problems. And she met Tracy Tarleton.
Tracy at the time had a pretty significant problem with alcohol. And it got to the point where she was feeling suicidal.
Tracy had some legitimate issues that she was trying to deal with.
Her mental health would go, and then she'd start self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And when that would happen, her bipolar disorder would kick into gear.
During their brief time together, the two women became friends.
Celeste felt sorry for Tracy. Tracy's not very attractive physically. Celeste felt sorry for her.
Tracy is funny, and Tracy is bright. I think they had similar sense of humors, that they could get along.
After they were both out of the hospital, they did continue a friendship.
Because of the communications they were having, long phone calls, Stephen Beard realized that Celeste Beard was involved in some kind of what seemed to be a very serious friendship to him at the time with Tracy Tarleton. But he at that point had never met Tracy Tarleton.
That changed in August of 1999, a little more than a month before the shooting.
Stephen Beard decides he wants to meet this person who seems to be such an integral part of his wife's life. Her name's Celeste Beard invites Tracy over. Stephen Beard is friendly toward Tracy, welcomes her into his home, cooks dinner for them.
But after dinner, while Tracy and Celeste are sitting outside, things took an unexpected turn.
Tracy was drunk and trying to kiss Celeste.
Christina sees them kiss, and then she goes to tell Steve what she witnessed. Stephen Beard confronts Tracy and tells her she needs to leave. He's not violent about it. He doesn't throw her out of the house. He tells her she needs to leave, and she does leave.
She had stormed out of the house, and she was arrested that night by the Austin police. The charge was driving while intoxicated.
Now investigators wonder, had Celeste's would-be lover sought her revenge?
Tracy is having these mental issues, a very fragile person emotionally, and she meets Celeste Beard, and she falls in love with Celeste Beard.
Tracy firmly believed the thing standing between her everlasting happiness with Celeste was Stephen Beard.
When confronted by police, Tracy doesn't deny shooting Stephen.
When the investigating officers went to Tracy Tarleton's home in South Austin, she was surrounded by candles and photographs of Celeste, obsessed with Celeste. She turned over the shotgun to him. I suppose she knew that the jig was up, that she was caught.
Investigators take Tracy into custody and then inform Celeste that her friend has been arrested.
It was devastating for her. Celeste didn't want to believe that Tracy had been the one that had done this because she tried to be a friend to Tracy, and she was in denial for a long time until they tested ballistics. You can actually test ballistics of a shotgun shell. Were able to tell that the shotgun shell that was found on the floor of Stephen's bedroom was fired by the gun that Tracy Tarleton had.
While the prosecutors build their case against Tracy, Stephen struggles to overcome his devastating injuries.
He was in the hospital a couple months.
Celeste visited him as much as she could on a daily basis. She had, in anticipation of him being released from the hospital, wheelchair ramps made, looking forward to getting him home again where she could take care of him.
But Stephen never fully recovers from his wound and dies in the hospital on January 22nd, 2000.
The medical examiner said it was caused by pulmonary embolism related to him being shot. Therefore, the cause of death is the gunshot.
Before Stephen's death, she was charged with aggravated assault, and injury to an elderly individual. After Stephen's death, Tracy was charged with capital murder.
Coming up, a young widow goes to any lengths to get a fresh start on love.
We found that Stephen was her fourth marriage.
Then you began to wonder if there was perhaps a more sinister connection.
At the end of February, Tracy Tarleton is in the Travis County, Texas jail, charged with murdering Austin millionaire Stephen Beard.
It wasn't a whodunit. We know who pulled the trigger. It was Tracy Tarleton.
She didn't get rid of the shotgun. I'm not sure that she actually realized that she had left evidence at the scene. So the case against her was strong.
Was Stephen Beard simply the victim of Tracy's obsession with his wife, Celeste? Or was there a piece missing?
Our minds kept coming back to this fact of it was easy for her to get in there and that none of the alarms were set in that area of the house and the door was unlocked.
I think there was suspicion from the very first night that Celeste was involved.
She may have played a role in this plan.
Although questioned repeatedly by investigators, Tracy adamantly denies that Celeste had anything to do with Stephen's death.
Even after she acknowledged that she had been in fact the one who shot Stephen Beard, she still didn't reveal any sort of encouragement that she had received, or certainly any sort of coordination with Celeste Beard.
Over the weeks that follow, friends of Stephen and Celeste started reaching out to the investigators, and their stories paint a very different picture of what investigators believed was a happy marriage.
According to the people who were hanging around with her, she was going through a lot of men, entertaining a lot of sexual partners. She was living an extremely extravagant, lavish, single lifestyle.
After Stephen died, Celeste just kind of went crazy. She went on a spree of drinking and partying and going out and making a mess of her life.
You know, going on a trip to New Orleans and other places, taking girlfriends along, hanging out at 6th Street, going to all the bars, just celebrating life.
According to friends, she's also burning through Stephen's millions at an alarming rate.
From the funeral on, Celeste Beard seems intent on squandering the rest of Stephen Beard's estate. It's just a girl gone wild, is what it seemed like after Stephen Beard's death.
Based on her unusual behavior following her husband's death, investigators began digging into Celeste's past.
We found that Stephen was her fourth marriage. She had had marriages along the West Coast before she moved to Austin with her third husband.
Celeste and her third husband divorced shortly before she married Stephen, but according to friends, they continued to sleep together after the divorce.
Celeste would have affairs with her ex-husband, but she said she never thought of it as an affair because she had already been married to him, so it didn't count as an affair.
In addition to the infidelity, investigators also learned that Celeste has a criminal record.
She had been charged with a fraud crime in Arizona, for which she was on probation for, unknown to Stephen Beard at the time they had been married.
Then you began to wonder whether or not there was perhaps a more sinister connection between Tracy and Celeste Beard.
There was no way that we were going to be able to prove a case against Celeste without Tracy's testimony. So Tracy's lawyers from the beginning were hinting around to the prosecutors that Tracy had a story to tell, and they wanted immunity for her testimony. But the DA's office was not willing to give her complete immunity and no punishment.
Once again, Tracy refuses to implicate Celeste.
She was hesitant to make any sort of connection as far as motivation to Celeste.
But would Tracy change her tune after Celeste met a new man?
She met Cole Johnson at a bar where he was bartending on 6th Street. For Celeste Beard, that's kind of par for the course.
He kind of straightened her up, saw that she was being very self-destructive, and convinced her to pull back.
Then, in July of 2000, just a few months after meeting, and barely 6 months after Stephen's death, Celeste and Cole become man and wife.
There's no question, given her history, that she's going to be married again soon. But, ultimately, that was her downfall, and it was clear from that marriage to Cole Johnson. Tracy Tarleton decided that she should come forward and tell the truth.
Tracy realized that she had been used and became willing to tell the rest of the story.
Coming up, the wages of a marriage gone haywire.
Celeste despised the fact that she had to have a sexual relationship with him.
Awaiting trial for the murder of Austin media mogul Stephen Beard, 42-year-old Tracy Tarleton has refused to implicate Beard's wife Celeste in the Millionaires' murder.
She's going to take responsibility for this murder. She's not going to name Celeste Beard as being involved in it. She's just going to take the full rap, but then she's betrayed by Celeste Beard.
A few months after Stephen's death, Celeste meets a bartender named Cole Johnson, and he becomes her 5th husband.
And what Tracy Tarleton provided was the details of the planning and the actual details of Celeste Beard encouraging, aiding, and assisting her in causing the death of Stephen Beard. She gave all the details.
Tracy tells detectives that at first, money hadn't been an issue for Celeste.
In order to make sure that she had access to her own money, he set up a trust fund for her, and he put in $500,000, $500,000 in this trust fund. She just blew through it. It was 6 months that she went through that $500,000. It's not clear exactly where all the money was going. A lot of it was in high-end fashion, stuff that she never ever wore, handbags and dresses and jewelry.
Celeste bragged one day that somebody asked her, "What's the most you've ever spent in one day?" And she said $50,000.
Stephen Beard approaches her and says, "You are squandering this entire estate. You are destroying everything I've spent my life building. I can't be with you anymore." He begins divorce proceedings. Her response to that is like she's going to kill herself. And then she's taken to the psychiatric unit of a local hospital for treatment. And it meets this woman by the name of Tracy Tarleton.
I think Celeste manipulated everyone in her life, including her husband and her children, and then later Tracy Tarleton. And she was able to manipulate Tracy because Tracy was particularly vulnerable.
They right away started some kind of close friendship. I think early on they were very huggy and even kissed.
According to Tracy, Celeste also made it clear that she was unhappy with Stephen.
She despised the fact that she had to have a sexual relationship with him every once in a while.
There was evidence that Celeste had been drugging Stephen, that she would crush up sleeping pills and put them in his food, and that she would substitute Everclear for vodka in his drinks, just have him pass out so that I don't have to deal with him.
And then Celeste would go out and party all night long. And the next day she would be difficult to wake up because she'd been up all night.
Tracy tells police that once they were both out of the psychiatric hospital, Celeste continued to drug her husband and sneak out to spend time with her new friend.
Celeste Beard went out of her way to have contact with Tracy Tarleton and increase this relationship to the point that it became a sexual relationship.
From the prosecution standpoint, yes, it seemed like she was using sex and love to get what she wanted from Tracy. And to Tracy, the love was the important thing.
According to Tracy, Celeste made what she wanted abundantly clear.
It had been kind of planted in her mind that Celeste was being, treated horribly by Stephen Beard, that if he were to be gotten rid of, that she and Celeste could be together.
Tracy's motive was simply love. She loved Celeste Beard. She's never been anything other than totally honest with this.
And Celeste had everything to gain from her husband's death.
He was probably going to divorce her. They had a prenuptial agreement, and any money that she was entitled to related to those agreements, she had already spent.
But if they were still married at the time of his death, she was going to be in a position to inherit his wealth. What Celeste stood to gain was mostly the money.
Tracy says that once she agreed to kill Stephen, Celeste had promised to clear her path.
The alarm system would be off and the door would be open. She could get in and get out undetected.
She came into the bedroom, shot him in the stomach, and then left.
But she'd failed to kill Stephen outright and left a vital piece of evidence behind.
It was a very poorly planned shooting. She used a 20-gauge shotgun with birdshot. The only shell that was fired ejected, and it was left there.
Tracy Tarleton pulled the trigger. The evidence clearly shows that. But the only reason Tracy Tarleton pulled the trigger in this case was because of Celeste Beard.
Once Tracy flipped and agreed to testify against Celeste, then the prosecution got an indictment against Celeste and had her arrested.
She was charged with capital murder. The automatic punishment if you're found guilty is life in prison.
Coming up, a dramatic trial becomes a loving parent's worst nightmare.
Just for Celeste to sit in the courtroom, it destroyed her.
When Celeste Beard goes on trial for murder in March of 2003, the salacious details have all of Austin, Texas buzzing.
You had a person who hoped to be a rich heiress with this lesbian lover who ultimately murders her rich older husband by shotgun. So all those things added up to what was basically for many people a soap opera that they couldn't stop following.
This perhaps mentally imbalanced woman killing out of lesbian love, and it sounded like some kind of made-for-TV movie.
The prosecution lays out their case first.
The evidence will show that what happened here is a simple case of a greedy, manipulative defendant who took advantage of a mentally ill woman who was in love with her.
Tracy would be showing up at the trial to say she pulled the trigger. So the question of the trial was, why would Tracy Tarleton kill Stephen Beard? Was there somebody who encouraged her, aided her, assisted her, who pushed her to pull the trigger? And so our case focused on proving the relationship between Tracy Tarleton and Celeste Beard.
Her testimony came across as very believable because she did not minimize her involvement in it. And she acknowledged right up front that she had committed this murder, that she had done this thing that was wrong, and that she deserved to be punished for it.
She also has some surprising backup.
Both daughters, Jennifer and Christina, testified against their mother.
They really corroborated some things that even Tracy had said, and so it helped to bolster Tracy's testimony.
They understood and witnessed that this was a actual romantic relationship. One of them saw them in bed together. One of them saw them kissing on at least a couple of occasions.
Her daughter's testimony is a cruel blow for Celeste.
He was our dad. We loved him. And he took him away from us.
Celeste was crushed that they turned against her. Just for Celeste to sit in the courtroom with her daughter on the witness stand talking about things that would hurt Celeste, it destroyed her.
But when it's the defense's turn, they claim that Celeste's daughters had their own motive to betray their mother.
The daughters did this thinking that they would get more of Stephen's inheritance.
I think the defense tried to also kind of paint them as, angry teenagers striking out against their mother.
Tracy knew that the defense's whole case also depended on attacking her. And so their strategy was to attack her as mentally ill and delusional and predatory.
We believe that the evidence will show you Tracy Tarleton is not worthy of belief. Tracy was delusional. The delusion was that she and Celeste were lovers. Celeste denied it. Celeste had resisted her advances.
The defense tried to kind of paint her as some mentally unbalanced person who had this affection that was not returned and that she was acting clearly on her own.
Will it be enough to convince the jury that Celeste is innocent?
The jury was out several days. I was very hopeful. The longer a jury deliberates, the more you know that there are members of the jury that have a different view from the prosecution.
Finally, after nearly 3 days of deliberation, the jury makes its decision.
The jury came back with a guilty on capital murder.
I remember her being pretty emotional. She really had thought she was going to get away with it.
Instead of enjoying Stephen's millions, Celeste will most likely spend the rest of her life in prison.
Capital murder is automatic life sentence.
So she has an eligibility for parole, but it's, like another 20 plus years from now.
In exchange for her testimony, Tracy receives a 20-year sentence with the possibility of parole in 10 years.
Steve's family was involved in the decision to offer Tracy a deal. They felt like Tracy is not a person who would have done this on her own.
You have a gentle soul who's pushed to this crazy act of murder. And she causes this death that she's going to have wear on her soul for the rest of her life.
After the trial was over, the family requested to meet with Tracy and expressed their thanks to her for telling the truth and for making it possible for Celeste to be held accountable for their father's death. Celeste loved money. She loved material things. She loved status. And in the end, that was more important to her than her husband, her children, and the people in her life.